So let's talk about February 28th, 2026. That's the day the United States launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran. But as the first bombs started to fall, a totally different question began to bubble up back home. A big one. Was this war really about national security, or was it maybe about something else entirely?
And this quote right here, it gets to the absolute heart of what we're digging into today. When a major conflict kicks off, it doesn't just dominate the headlines. No, it can completely wipe other critical stories right off the map. It creates this fog, and our job together is to try and see through it.
Because really, the most important question isn't just why these strikes happened, it's why they happened at this exact moment. Was this some urgent geopolitical necessity that just couldn't wait another day? Or was it a politically convenient escape hatch?
All right, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the incredible pressure the president was under at home. Then we'll define this wag the dog theory and weigh the evidence, both for and against this being a distraction. And finally, we'll pull it all together into a more complex reality and give you a citizen's watch list for the future.
Okay, so first things first. If we want to understand the motive for a potential diversion, we have to grasp the sheer scale of the crisis. I mean, in the weeks leading up to this war, the administration was getting hit from all sides by political threats that were honestly unprecedented.
Let's start with the Epstein investigation. This was not your typical partisan squabble. You've got 55% of people disapproving of the president's handling of it, and get this, nearly half the country believing he was actively covering it up. This thing was cutting across party lines, creating massive pressure from every direction.
And listen to this. When you have a member of the president's own party describing a scandal as bigger than Watergate, you just know the internal alarm bells are screaming. This wasn't just bad press. This was seen as an existential threat to the administration itself.
Then, on February 20th, a bombshell legal defeat. The Supreme Court strikes down his signature tariff policy. Immediately, his economic approval ratings just tank. And then, what happens just 8 days later? Bombs start falling on Iran. That whole tariff story, which was the defining economic issue of his presidency, was instantly buried.
This whole sequence of events, it leads us right to a classic theory in political science. It's called the Wag the Dog theory. So, let's break down exactly what that means.
The wag the dog idea is actually pretty simple. When you're in a whole lot of trouble at home, you create a bigger crisis somewhere else, abroad. The whole strategy is designed to trigger what's called the rally around the flag effect. When there's an international crisis, people tend to support their leaders, and for a little while at least, forget all about the problems at home.
And look, this is hardly a new accusation. It was famously thrown at President Clinton back in 1998. It's even been applied to this president twice before, in 2017 during the Russia investigation and again in 2020 during his first impeachment. So the point is, there's already an established pattern here, at least when it comes to the accusation.
So with that theory in mind, let's really build the case. What is the evidence that this was a classic diversionary war?
Just look at this timeline again. It's pretty damning. The pressure from the Epstein files, that humiliating Supreme Court defeat, economic numbers cratering. It all peaks in this tight, 2-week window. Then, boom, February 28th, war begins, and every single one of those stories instantly disappears from the front pages. I mean, the timing is, to say the very least, highly suspicious.
And here's another thing. The strikes were launched while there were still active diplomatic talks going on with Tehran. Think about it. If your goal is truly just national security, you'd probably want to exhaust diplomacy first, right? But if your goal is political survival, if you need a distraction right now, then suddenly diplomacy doesn't look like a tool. It looks like an obstacle.
Okay, but to be fair, we have to look at the other side of the coin. So now, let's make the case against this being a simple diversion. What were the legitimate reasons for going to war? Because real threats absolutely existed, totally separate from any domestic scandal. Iran's nuclear program was a documented, long-term security concern for years. There was also a real strategic window that was open, with Iran's proxy network at its weakest point in decades. And, what's more, if this whole thing was a distraction, it hasn't really worked perfectly. The country is still deeply divided, which has really limited that rally around the flag effect.
So, if it's not definitively one or the other, what is the most likely answer here? Well, the truth, as it so often is, seems to be a lot more layered, a lot more complex.
This lever analogy is probably the best way to think about it. The security concerns were real. Let's say that pressure alone got the lever maybe 70% of the way to war. But then you add in the domestic crises, the Epstein files, the Supreme Court defeat, the collapsing polls.
Well, that likely provided the final, desperate 30% push needed to pull that lever right now, instead of waiting for diplomacy to play out. So the war might have happened eventually, sure, but the political situation at home almost certainly made it happen now.
So what does all this mean for you? How can you think critically about this stuff when the next international crisis inevitably takes over your screen?
When you lay it all out, the evidence is really complex. The timing and the pattern, they strongly suggest diversion was a factor. But the existence of a very real threat and a strategic opportunity, you just can't ignore that. It really seems like both things can be true at the same time. And that, right there, is probably the reality of the situation.
So here's a framework for you, a citizen's watch list. First, always question the timing of a new conflict. What else was happening? Second, follow the story that just vanished from the headlines and ask yourself if it's being intentionally forgotten. Third, demand that accountability for domestic issues doesn't get a free pass just because a war has started. And finally, number 4, always try to accept the complexity, that a real threat and a political motive can, and very often do, exist at the exact same time. Which leaves us with this final question. The next time the world is suddenly gripped by a new international crisis, I want you to ask yourself, which story truly matters more? The one that is just beginning, or the one that was just pushed off the stage?